The Middle East North Africa International Terrorism Subcommittee hearing on the crisis in Idlib will be called to order. I will recognize myself for purposes of making an opening statement, and then we'll yield to Mr. Wilson, the ranking member. I welcome everyone who's here today. I'm grateful to the witnesses for appearing. We're here to hear testimony on the crisis in Idlib province in northwestern Syria. And I will begin. The military assault in Idlib is a painful reminder that the Syrian conflict is far from over and that the international community must act to mitigate the humanitarian disaster in northwestern Syria. Since December 1st, nearly 1 million people, half of them children, have been displaced, forced to flee their homes in the dead of winter. Those lucky enough to find housing live in overcrowded conditions, often without electricity. The vast majority sleep in tents or out in the open as temperatures plunge. Small children are freezing to death as families crowd into any semblance of shelter. Assad, Russia, and Iran have violated ceasefires and have flagrantly disregarded international law in their assaults on Idlib, where they have attacked hospitals, schools, shelters, health clinics, and residential areas. We have photos here today submitted by the Syrian Emergency Task Force of the destruction and devastation in Idlib. Now, I greatly appreciate the recent pledge of $108 million in humanitarian assistance by the United States. The administration must now encourage our allies and partners to increase their contributions and meet the needs of those suffering in Idlib. The U.S. must also continue to advocate for unfettered humanitarian access, including by defending cross-border aid and enhance diplomatic efforts to achieve a permanent ceasefire that can lead to a final political settlement in Syria. I wrote a letter to Secretary Pompeo emphasizing these points and offering congressional assistance in prioritizing the humanitarian crisis in Idlib, and I encourage all of my colleagues to join me in signing it. There are innocent people suffering in Idlib, and I want to use my time today to let members hear directly from them. And with the ranking member's consent, I'd like to play a message that we received from Idlib. Ms. Mumina Al-Qasim is an English teacher at a school for orphaned children in Idlib, supported by American communities in Arkansas and Pennsylvania. Mumina recorded a video for this hearing to share the pain that Syrians are experiencing every day. For her safety, she has chosen to cover her face. She is sharing her own words and her own thoughts with us today.
Assalamu alaikum. إنه لشرف لي أن أرسل إليكم هذا الفيديو يا من تمثلون الشعب الأمريكي، وأدعو الله لكم أن يحفظكم ويرزقكم السعادة، وأرجو من الله أن يصل صوتي إليك سيدي الرئيس ترامب. من المؤكد أنكم ترون ما حصل في إدلب خاصة وفي جميع أنحاء سوريا عامة. الذي يحصل لنا لا يمكن لأي عقل بشري أن يستوعبه. تهجير وتدمير وقتل من قبل الظالم بشار الأسد وممن يدعمونه من روسيا وإيران وغيرهم. صراحة الكلام يطول عن ظلم بشار الأسد وأعوانه، ولكن يمكن أن تتخيلوا معي بعضا من المآسي التي تحصل هنا. تصوروا إخوتي، أنتم الذين تسمعون صوتي، أنت أخي، أنت أختي، أنك خرجت صباحا للعمل وسمعت صوت الطائرة الروسية أو مروحية بشار ذات البراميل المتفجرة، فاختبأت بمكان ما خلف جدار أو في بيت أحد ما، وعدت بسرعة إلى بيتك بعد أن سقط البرميل، حيث تكون الصدمة الكبرى. منزلك أصبح ركاما يحوي بداخله عائلتك بأسرها، ضاع بيتك، ضاعت زوجتك، فقدت أولادك. والآن بهذه المعارك التي تدور في إدلب وريفها تبقى قلوبنا معلقة في أرضنا ومنازلنا، حتى أننا حملنا برامج على هواتفنا المحمولة تظهر لنا مقدار الدمار الذي حصل في مدينة إدلب. وفي فيديو أرسله لكم يظهر فيه بيت أهل زوجي الذي أصبح مساويا للأرض ليس له وجود أبدا. فأنتم إخوتي يا من تسمعون صوتي تصوروا هناك 4 ملايين مهجرا خرجوا قسرا من منازلهم، بينهم مليون طفل أصبحوا مشردين، منهم من وجد منزلا يؤويه، ومنهم وهم الفئة الأكثر من أصبح تحت خيمة لا تسمن ولا تغني من جوع، وغيرها من المآسي الكثير. فما بالكم بمن فقد بصره أو أطرافه بسبب قذيفة أو ضربة طائرة وغيرها الكثير والكثير. والآن أنا أغتنم الفرصة وفي هذا الفيديو أرسل لكم مطالب الشعب السوري. نريد حظرا جويا يمنع طائرات بشار الأسد والطائرات الروسية من دخول الأجواء وقصف المدنيين ووقف القتل بسرعة. نريد العودة إلى منازلنا ووقف المآسي والأوجاع التي يمر بها السوريون. نريد أن نعيش بسلام مثل أي إنسان في هذا العالم. سيدي الرئيس ترامب وأعضاء الكونغرس، أرجو منكم مساعدتنا بشكل مباشر. إلى الآن لم أسمع منكم إلا كلاما أنكم تقفون مع الشعب السوري وأن الشعوب هي من تقرر مصيرها. نريد فعلا وأن تكون مساعدتنا بشكل ملموس. نريد إسقاط النظام المجرم وطرد المحتلين الروس والإيرانيين من سوريا. سوريا فقط للشعب السوري. طبعا أنا باسمي وباسم أهل إدلب أشكر الشعب الأمريكي الذي كان معنا منذ سنوات وأهل ولاية أركانسا وبنسلفانيا والولايات الأمريكية الأخرى لدعمهم المتواصل لروضتنا ولإرسالهم المئات من رسائل الأمل التي تزين جدران دار الحكمة. وأشكركم من كل قلبي لاستماعكم، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Thank you to Mamina for her bravery in recording this message. As this conflict enters its 10th year, we have a lot to discuss today about how the United States can best assist in ending this war, in bringing peace to Syria, in addressing the dire humanitarian crisis that Mamina spoke of, that the world must take note of. And again, I'm really grateful for our witnesses for being here to lead us in this important conversation. And I yield to the ranking member his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Chairman Ted Deutsch, for calling this important hearing on the ongoing developments in Idlib, Syria. I especially appreciated hearing from the educators you just provided, and indeed, Mr. Chairman, your leadership on bringing this to the attention of the American people. It's sad to me that as we begin, it's very clear the American media has not covered this with the urgency that it should, as indicated by the empty table where they should be located. And it's just horrifying, and that's why I appreciate Stephanie Pendarvis and our office has brought just in the last 24 hours information to me that I want the American people to know that the persons affected in the Idlib area are 3.5 million people. That's inconceivable, that many people at risk. Additionally, the regime's attacks on the Idlib area have displaced a million people, and it should be noted that most are women, 21%, and children, 60%. This is such a crisis and so obvious. In the picture of the children, and I had visited in Jordan a camp to see the children there who fled. The two-thirds of the entire refugee population in the world are now in Turkey. And they're taking care of 3.6 million Syrians in Turkey, as well as 5 million Syrians that are under the Syrian side of the Turkish border. Additionally, there's humanitarian crisis and the attacking by Russian aircraft, killing Turkish military personnel, and the again, it's sad to me. I'm not critical as much as I'm sad. The American media, when they present it, it's unintelligible who is good, who is bad, leaving out the alliance of Assad, Moscow, and Tehran. But indeed, the strong efforts by our NATO ally, Turkey, to try to protect the public, and the strong humanitarian aid, Mr. Chairman, that you mentioned, that President Trump has authorized on top of all that we all have already provided, as evidenced by the video that we just saw. In nearly a decade, the world has stood by and watched as the barbaric Assad regime and its backers in Russia and Iran indiscriminately butcher the Syrian people in order to cling to power. They've killed nearly 500,000 Syrians, committed countless atrocities, and have perpetrated egregious war crimes. As has been said before, and we need to say again, that we should be very clear that Bashar Assad must go. The Assad regime is illegitimate. It has barbarically used chemical weapons to murder its own citizens, and the United States must unequivocally demand Assad leave as the first step to the future of a new Syria. For months now, we have seen the situation in Idlib province in Syria go from bad to worse. It's perhaps the greatest human rights atrocity since the beginning of Assad's genocidal campaign. Hospitals, schools, and humanitarian aid workers have been targeted routinely. Nearly 1 million refugees have fled Russian and regime aerial bombardments, precipitating what could be the biggest refugee crisis in European history. In response, the months of pro-regime escalation in Idlib have culminated in the Russian airstrike that killed 33 Turkish troops in late February. Turkey has launched Operation Spring Shield in northwest Syria. According to Turkey, this operation has led to the killing of over 3,000 Syrian soldiers and significant destruction of Syrian regime military hardware provided by the Russians, including 3 jets, 3 UAVs, 8 helicopters, 135 tanks, and 5 air defense systems. And we need to be clear, the United States has many challenging and persistent disagreements with our ally Turkey. But I commend the Trump administration for supporting the Turkish operation to beat back the Assad regime. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo clearly stated that the U.S. stands with Turkish efforts to stop the Assad regime, Russia, and Iran in Idlib. It was heartening to see the Trump administration's ambassador to the United Nations, Kelly Craft, along with U.S. Special Representative for Syria, Jim Jeffrey, in Idlib just last week, meeting with the White Helmets, the Syrian civil defense. That meeting sent a strong message of support and solidarity to the people of Syria. It also facilitated important ammunition and intelligence cooperation between the United States and Turkey. Another senior Trump administration official, Joel Rayburn, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Levant, met with the Saudi Arabian Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, Adil Jabir, clinching Saudi's support for the Turkish operation in Idlib. These diplomatic developments may be discounted, but they carry a lot of weight with the Syrian people who have been targeted for a decade as the world debates on what to do next. These actions are also monitored in Damascus, Moscow, and Tehran. I'm grateful that in recent weeks, the governments of both Germany and the Netherlands have expressed support for a no-fly zone or a protected area in Idlib, as has been provided in Erbil in northern Iraq previously. We need to support efforts that could lead to a safe haven for peaceful Syrian civilians and save countless lives. Additionally, the most humanitarian solution for Idlib in Syria is to help people return and stay at their homes. This cannot occur so long as Assad is in power, and we should insist that the regime be held to account and ultimately removed. I am really grateful to see that politics is stopping at the water's edge, led by Chairman Ted Deutsch. We'll be working together to support the people of Syria against the Assad regime and its backers in Russia and Iran. And I look forward to the hearing from our experts today. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. And before we turn to the witnesses, we're grateful that the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Eliot Engel, has joined us, and I'd be glad to yield to him for any statement he wishes to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted very much to come here because I think this subject is just so important. So thank you for calling this hearing today and for the opportunity to say a few words. I heard what you said and what Mr. Wilson said. I certainly agree with everything that both of you have said. I've been doing a lot of work vis-a-vis Syria, and it breaks my heart to see what the Syrian people have gone through. I know there are many good Syrian-American groups that are working very, very hard and I commend them, and I work with them. It's really hard to believe what's happened in Syria. It's hard to believe that it's been nearly a decade since the civil war erupted in Syria, and that's when many of us began focusing on the conflict, looking for a way to end the bloodshed and put the Syrian people on the path towards a brighter future. And there's no other way to put it. Those efforts have really been a failure of American leadership, a failure of countries around the world. The Syrian people deserve better. Instead, 600,000 have lost their lives. 600,000, think about that. It's almost unthinkable. Millions more have lost their homes, and the violence goes on and on and on. Assad and Iran and Russia are undeterred. Assad's military and Russian forces continue to target hospitals, relief centers, and other civilian infrastructure. People flee and go into hospitals, and then they bomb the hospitals. It's just horrific. And we watch in horror with what's happening now in Idlib, where over 500,000 people have been displaced in the last 2 months alone, and entire neighborhoods turn to dust. We see the humanitarian crisis. It's just heartbreaking, it's infuriating, it's frustrating. Ranking Member McCall and I, together, have pressed Secretary Pompeo to take steps to push for a stop to the violence and demand accountability for what's happening in Idlib. While I appreciate Ambassador Jeffrey's announcement on Tuesday of a small amount of additional humanitarian aid to the area, this does not address the needs of the hundreds of thousands still fleeing the Assad regime's brutality or help bring about a lasting end to this heinous conflict. And I must be honest, it's frustrating. There has been bipartisan support in Congress for dialing up pressure on the Assad regime and to crack down on its enablers. Finally, last year, after years of effort, we passed the Syria sanctions bill, my bill, and it became law. We've given the administration the tools. Now we simply want them to use those tools. But the administration, unfortunately, is sitting on its hands, and we've seen no real strategy, no real vision for how this horrific crisis could be brought to an end. I refuse to give up hope. And as long as I'm a member of this body, I will continue to push for an end to the violence and suffering and to demand that those responsible face justice. I'm very grateful to this distinguished panel for sharing their time and their expertise. And again, I thank our chairman for the time and for bringing this subcommittee's focus to such an important matter. I'm pleased to be the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. We have members on both sides of the aisle who work together, who understand that America cannot abandon things that happen in the Middle East or any place else, that we need to be right up there front and center and call it what it is. It's a genocide, and it's a terrible, terrible thing that's going on. The world is just sitting by. America has to continue to take a strong stance, and I will be there every step of the way. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Engel. Members of the subcommittee can give opening statements of up to 1 minute if they choose. Mr. Shabbat, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. We're witnessing the latest crisis in the Syrian civil war as Assad tries to retake Idlib. I happen to be chairman of this subcommittee when this war began back in 2011, 2012, and watching this thing unfold has just been horrific. Assad has gone to truly barbaric lengths to regain his hold on power, whether it's bombing hospitals or using chemical weapons against civilians. It goes on, and as members have stated, fortunately, this committee has acted in a bipartisan manner. Unfortunately, the world, to a considerable degree, has stood by and watched and not been willing to aid in any serious way. Since the beginning of December, Assad's assault on Idlib has sent almost 1 million people fleeing toward the Turkish border. They're living in desperate conditions without proper shelter, heating, food, medical care, harsh winter coming. The situation there is absolutely reprehensible and needs to change. For these reasons, the United States must continue to push for a political solution and commit to achieving a humanitarian outcome. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Cicilline, recognized for a minute.
Thank you. I thank the chairman and the ranking member for holding this important hearing. As we enter nearly the 9th year of the Syrian civil war, it's apparent that the presence of foreign proxy fighters has further complicated the situation and resulted in a significant escalation of this conflict. Of course, the recent deaths of dozens of Turkish soldiers and the ongoing fighting in the Idlib province further reinforces our need to increase efforts to work with our partners to bring an end to this conflict. The human costs are difficult to exaggerate. The suffering of the Syrian people will, of course, be exacerbated by further fighting. According to the State Department, nearly a third of the population of Idlib has been displaced as a result of this crisis since December 2019, calling it, and I quote, the largest internal displacement of people that we've seen in such a short period of time in Syria in the whole war. This is unconscionable. As Congress continues to assess U.S. policy in this region, it's critical that we bear in mind the vulnerable populations affected by these actions. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I look forward to your views on what we can do as members of Congress to help bring an end to this conflict. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Any other members wishing to make opening statements? Seeing none, we'll turn to the witnesses. Ms. Dana Struhl is the Shelley and Michael Kasson Fellow in the Washington Institute's Beth and David Goddard Program on Arab Politics. She previously served for 5 years as a senior professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and in 2019 served as co-chair of the Bipartisan Syria Study Group, which released its final report on U.S. policy toward the conflict in Syria in September. Before working on Capitol Hill, Ms. Struhl served in the Middle East Policy Office of the Secretary of Defense. Mr. Harden Lang is the Vice President for Programs and Policy at Refugees International. He has served in a number of United Nations peacekeeping and humanitarian field missions, including in Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon. In Iraq, he served as Chief of Staff for the International Organization for Migration's Humanitarian and Stabilization Mission. Prior to joining Refugees International, Harden was Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And finally, Ms. Jennifer Kaffir is the Research Director at the Institute for the Study of War. She previously led ISW's Syria team from 2014 to 2017 before becoming ISW's Director of Intelligence Planning from 2018 to 2019. She is a graduate of ISW's Hertog War Studies program. She's written extensively on Syria, Iraq, al-Qaeda, and ISIS, and regularly briefs military units preparing to deploy on a range of subjects, including Syria, ISIS, and Russia. Thank you all for being here today. Let me remind the witnesses to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared remarks will be made part of the hearing record. Thank you again so much for being here. Ms. Struhl, you're recognized.
Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for holding this hearing. I'm going to use my 5 minutes to do two things. First, situate the Idlib crisis in the broader context of U.S. interests and policies on Syria. Second, identify the risks and opportunities for the United States in Idlib. Idlib is the crucible of the war in Syria, with implications for all strategic challenges to U.S. interests: competition with Russia, countering terrorism, denying Iran's bid for long-term entrenchment, mitigating the Syrian refugee crisis, and protecting the rules-based international order. The administration's Syria policy ostensibly remains focused on three objectives: defeating ISIS, expelling Iran, and supporting a political process to end the war. Yet Syria has not been prioritized diplomatically, and the means to achieve these objectives have systematically been taken off the table: the cutoff in stabilization aid, blocked actions at the United Nations, and a reduced U.S. military presence in the Northeast. The administration has not changed its goals, but they are unachievable with less attention and less resources. In Idlib, the stated U.S. objective for a ceasefire is critical, but lamentably narrow. The March 5th Russia-Turkey ceasefire agreement will not prevent further violence in Idlib, fails to mitigate the humanitarian catastrophe, and does nothing to address the underlying causes of the Syria war: Assad regime's brutality towards its own people. One standout trend of the war is Russia's consistent failure to compel Assad to adhere to any agreement. In Idlib, the question is when, not if, violence will reignite. Also, the humanitarian crisis is intentional. Assad and Russia are weaponizing refugees in order to force European and Arab governments to fund reconstruction of the Syrian state absent any meaningful reform. But a strategic inflection point in the war might soon present opportunities. Consider the following. The Turkish military inflicted devastating damage to Assad's forces in Idlib. Going forward, he will be constrained in launching new operations. Russian and Iranian support may be impacted by black swan events. The coronavirus outbreak and the Russia-Saudi OPEC feud have collapsed oil prices. Both of these trends will hammer the oil-dependent economies of Assad's backers. Anti-regime opposition is again stirring in the south. Regime-controlled areas are unstable. Russia and Iran do not have the resources to stabilize or rebuild Syria. Finally, Syria's economy continues to spiral downward, accelerated by the economic crisis in Lebanon and the U.S.-led sanctions regime. Here is the opportunity. We should start planning now for how we might leverage the next outbreak of violence to reinvigorate a political process. To do this, the U.S. should seek rapprochement with Turkey on Syria and continue to hold the line on political isolation, economic sanctions, and denial of reconstruction aid. Only if the regime credibly changes its behavior, including meaningful participation in the Geneva process, should we consider incremental steps to end Syria's diplomatic and economic isolation. With Turkey, now is the time to pursue a pragmatic solution to the S-400 issue. The Turkish military ably performed in Idlib, but Ankara still seeks diplomatic and operational demonstrations of American and NATO support. Our consultations should focus not only on northwest Syria, but also the northeast, where the anti-ISIS mission remains incomplete. The risks. In Idlib, the conflict will be frozen or Idlib will collapse. The ceasefire has created an open-air prison along the Turkish border, housing extremists and civilians. Also, Assad's symbiotic relationship with al-Qaeda is well known. We should expect that if his regime takes Idlib, extremist elements there will be co-opted and weaponized at a time of his choosing. Regime victory in Idlib enables continuity in Iran's strategy for entrenching long-term interests. And finally, the path to a negotiated, durable solution to the war is over if Assad, backed by Russia and Iran, believes he can win militarily in Idlib. In the medium to long term, at risk is the U.S.-backed global order. Putin aims to weaken and ultimately destroy this rules and norms-based system. We know what a Russia-dominated Middle East looks like. Idlib, autocrats terrorizing their own populations, chemical weapons, mass casualty bombs, routinized torture, harboring of extremists, cooperation with Iran, and weaponization of refugees, all while enjoying protection from accountability at the UN Security Council due to the Russian veto. Russia is not a partner for peace. Yet the trend remains diplomats, military officials, business people in the region flocking to Moscow and welcoming Putin at home. This trend will not be reversed or at best slowed if the U.S. is not prepared to seize opportunities in Syria. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Struhl. Mr. Lang, you're recognized.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Chairman Deutsch and Ranking Member Wilson and members of the subcommittee for holding this hearing today. I will spend my 5 minutes addressing the humanitarian aspects of the crisis, its implications, and prospects for the new ceasefire. As the committee well knows, President Erdogan and President Putin reached a ceasefire on hostilities in Idlib on 5 March. While there have been reports of sporadic fighting along the front line, the ceasefire seems largely to be holding. The agreement brings a badly needed respite to civilian populations of Idlib. However, few expect for it to hold for long. President Assad remains committed to regaining control over the entirety of Syria's territory, and Russia has demonstrated little interest in restraining its clients in Damascus. That said, we must do everything we can to strengthen the ceasefire, prolong its duration, and ease the conditions of millions of suffering in Idlib. Civilians in the province tell us that they see the Turkish intervention and the ensuing ceasefire as their last hope. We should listen to their voices. While the ceasefire has curbed the fighting, the humanitarian crisis continues to have devastating consequences. Over the course of 3 months, almost 1 million people were forced from their home. That's more people than the Rohingya Muslim displaced in Myanmar over the last 5 years. Simply put, this is as bad as it gets. The recent fighting aggravated a dire situation where almost 3/4 of the population were already in need of humanitarian assistance. Food prices have increased 120% in the last year. The displaced are trapped in makeshift camps along the Turkish border, where they struggle to have access to even basic assistance. Access to health care is a major challenge. The targeting of hospitals have significantly hampered care. The United Nations reports that 84 hospitals and clinics have suspended operations in Idlib in recent months. This means that next month alone, an additional 100,000 people will not get medical care. But shelter is perhaps the most acute need of the displaced. IDPs are living in schools, mosques, unfinished buildings. Many families are sharing a single tent. Others are sleeping on the ground in very harsh winter conditions, and children have literally frozen to death. Humanitarian organizations are struggling mightily to respond. In January, food assistance for some 1.4 million people was delivered, along with health supplies for about 500,000. All this is made possible by the UN cross-border mechanism. People in Idlib cannot be reached at this scale through any other means. The past year, Russia successfully pressured the United Nations Security Council to drop 2 of the cross-border points, and Russia may very well seek to close the remaining 2 from Turkey into Syria, and this cannot happen. In addition, funding for the humanitarian relief operation currently falls short of what is required. In late February, the Secretary General told us that he needed $500 million to assist the displaced for only 6 months. The United Nations reports that we have about half of that so far. Throughout the campaign, Russia and Syria and the Syrian regime have purposely targeted schools, hospitals, and civilian facilities. This past week, a UN investigation accused Russia for the first time of direct involvement in war crimes and indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas. Make no mistake, these are war crimes and they demand accountability. So what is the way forward? We have 6 key priorities. First, the United States should surge diplomatic support for the Turkey-Russian ceasefire and encourage our European and NATO allies to do the same. While we are a humanitarian organization, we are persuaded that strong pressure must be exerted on Russia and Syria if the ceasefire is to have any chance of lasting for any significant period of time. Second, we would encourage Turkey to protect civilians in areas under its control. With 20,000 troops in Idlib, Turkey has more boots on the ground than the UN stabilization and peacekeeping forces in Mali or Somalia. Turkey should leverage its significant presence and take measures to protect civilians at imminent risk of harm. Third, the United States should launch a full-court press at the UN Security Council to ensure the renewal of cross-border resolution and the reopening of the crossing points from Jordan and Iraq into Syria. Fourth, the United States should mobilize other donors to close the remaining gap of $250 million required for the humanitarian response. Donors should prioritize support for shelter, and they should look for creative ways to channel funding to local relief workers and to NGOs, local NGOs, who are on the front line of this response. Fifth, the United States should use the tools set out in the Caesar Act and other legislation to aggressively target those responsible for atrocities in Idlib. The United States should pressure other members of the United Nations Security Council and European Union to follow suit with measures of their own. And finally, we need to take steps to prepare for in the event of the collapse of the ceasefire. This means surging aid into northwest Syria now while we can get access, and helping Turkey to prepare potentially for a new wave of refugees. The United States should rally European and other national donors to provide Turkey with the necessary support if it is called upon to shoulder this burden. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Lang. Ms. Kaffir, you're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you. Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, and distinguished members of this subcommittee, thank you for inviting me today. I'm honored by the opportunity to testify on a critical national security issue facing our nation. It is difficult to talk about opportunities to make a difference in Syria. We've missed so many, and Syrians have suffered so much that it seems almost unreasonable to talk of possibility, of hope. But I'm going to do it anyway, because the story of Syria is one of unreasonable bravery, of civilians so courageous that they dared to stand up to a tyrant they knew would kill them. We've become numb to it, to the bravery, the suffering, the unimaginable toll of this war. But our exhaustion does not change the reality. This war is far from over. Syrians have not given up, and there are still opportunities to change the trajectory of this conflict. As has already been mentioned, the recent mass displacement caused by the military campaign waged by Russia, Iran, and Syrian President Bashar al-Assad is the largest of the war to date. The humanitarian crisis that it has caused is an unsustainable problem for Turkey, which cannot accept more refugees and is instead trying to repatriate the refugees it does have into other parts of northern Syria. Turkey launched a major military intervention in late January to prevent further civilian displacement, coming to blows with Russia, despite their past collaboration in Syria. It is the largest rift between Turkey and Russia in Syria to date. Turkey deployed as many as 20,000 troops to establish a defensible front line against Assad, Russia, and Iran.
Those troops are now establishing the start of a safe zone along the border, but without the resources to address the humanitarian crisis in that zone. Turkey's military pressure did succeed in forcing Putin into a new de-escalation agreement in Idlib, which was Erdogan's initial goal. But it will not last. And Turkey likely knows as much. Reports of pro-regime forces violating the ceasefire have already started to emerge. Al-Qaeda-affiliated forces have also unsurprisingly rejected the deal and have the ability to spoil its terms. The escalation cycle in Idlib will repeat again in coming months. There are good reasons not to want to help Turkey in Idlib. Turkey is not behaving like a NATO ally and should not be treated like one until that changes. Turkey has conducted ethnic cleansing of Syrian Kurds along the border and purchased the Russian S-400 missile system. Turkey is now deliberately sending vulnerable Syrian refugees to Greece in an attempt to force Europe to support Turkey in Idlib. The United States should not look past this behavior. However, Turkey's intervention creates an opportunity to help ameliorate a devastating and dangerous humanitarian crisis while accomplishing broader strategic interests. The U.S. should step in to support Turkey, but with serious conditions. It is time for Turkey to step away from its relationship with Russia and recommit to the NATO alliance. The support the U.S. should offer Turkey in Idlib includes Patriot missile systems to help establish a no-fly zone and deny the aerial campaign that has killed so many civilians. An immediate surge of vital humanitarian aid, including necessary supplies and equipment to react to any outbreak of the coronavirus or other diseases among this extremely vulnerable population. The U.S. should also lead a new fundraising effort to generate a humanitarian assistance fund to provide basic relief aid for a period of multiple years. This is a long-term problem. Finally, the U.S. should provide diplomatic pressure against Russia through the UN Security Council by submitting a resolution that specifies and condemns the war crimes in Idlib, including Russia's direct role in those atrocities. Russia will veto it, but forcing Russia to do so will set political conditions that strengthen Turkey's defensive position. The U.S. must be careful not to set unrealistic expectations for a Turkish-controlled zone in Idlib. It will not be fully stable, and it will not be fully secure. It will be penetrated by al-Qaeda-linked groups that are already operating within this vulnerable population and attempting to recruit them. However, stepping in to help save Syria's most vulnerable population is the most effective way to dampen al-Qaeda's recruitment and to help preserve vital sources of social pressure against its malign ideology. As I've mentioned, stepping into Idlib at this time will also help disrupt Russia's campaign in the Middle East, which is essential to preserving and strengthening the NATO alliance. In return for American support, the U.S. should demand that Turkey agree to 3 terms. First, return or destroy the Russian S-400 air defense system. 2, leave the Russian-led Astana process for negotiations in Syria and recommit to a UN-led process. And 3, agree to start a new process of bilateral negotiations with the United States over the outcome in northeast Syria, where U.S. forces continue to operate with our local partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces. These are big asks, but now is the time to make them. The scale of Turkey's military intervention in Idlib demonstrates the priority Turkey's President Erdogan places on preventing a further worsening of the refugee and humanitarian situation on the border. He has stepped up. It's time for the United States to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kaffir. We'll now turn to member questioning. I will defer initially, and pleased to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Wilson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And for everyone here, it's extraordinarily significant that Chairman Eliot Engel was here. It's also a credit to Chairman Ted Deutsch to get the big chairman to come to be with the subcommittee chair. And it shows indeed how significant this issue is and how helpful your comments are, and how we have such an opportunity for bipartisan cooperation to support the people of Syria. And I, again, was so grateful that the Trump administration, Ambassador to UN, Kelly Craft, along with the U.S. Special Representative for Syria, Jim Jeffrey, I just can't even imagine. They were in Idlib last week. I appreciate their courage. I appreciate their being there as a show of support to the people of Syria, where at least they knew about it. Somehow it wasn't covered here. Additionally, very significant for the Trump administration with Joel Rayburn, the Deputy Secretary of State for the Levant, to meet with the Saudi Arabian Minister of State for Foreign Affairs to cleanse Saudi support for the Turkish operation. in Idlib. That's another extraordinary step as y'all are recommending actions to be taken correctly. As we proceed with this, American taxpayers have provided more than $6 billion since 2011 to support the United Nations humanitarian programs in Syria. Yet, instead of giving aid and comfort to the millions of Syrians in desperate need of assistance, a substantial percentage has gone to line the pockets of the brutal Assad dictatorship. And that's why I introduced H.R. 4868, the Stop UN Support for Assad Act of 2019. Do you support the idea of pushing for accountability at the UN so that the Assad regime stops stealing from the victims? And what are the most important steps that the UN can take to ensure the aid programs are run in an accountable and transparent manner, beginning with Ms. Stroll?
Thank you for that question and for your leadership on this bill. My view is that we are reaching a very serious point this July when, in January, Russia and China together vetoed Resolution 2449, which allows 4 cross-border access points into Syria. In January, that was vetoed. There's now a 6-month Security Council resolution for only 2 cross-border points. The Secretary General provided a report to the Security Council about ways around that. They're not very promising. Come this July, Russia is aiming to close all cross-border access, which means that all UN aid and humanitarian operations will have to go through Damascus, and we know what the Assad regime does. He weaponizes that aid and steers it to communities, not based in an unfettered, need-based way, but based on who he wants to benefit, and it has lined the pockets of members of his regime. This is a really ugly choice for the United States in terms of how do we continue to provide funding to the UN when there may not be any way to reach the populations that we want to reach. I think we should begin exploring if there are ways outside the Security Council, given the fact that it has been rendered ineffective in holding Russia accountable for its actions in Syria.
Thank you. Mr. Lang?
Thank you for the question. Just sort of echo Dan a bit on this. The bottom line is that assistance is being channeled in through the regime in Damascus and flowing through the UN offices in Damascus. That assistance, the chances of it making any significant difference in the situation inside of Idlib are slim to none, right? The aid corridor that facilitates that kind of assistance getting in is the cross-border mechanism. Aid that's going to be sent through Damascus, in all likelihood, is simply going to be hijacked for the purposes of bringing additional pressure to bear on the civilian population inside of Idlib. And we've seen this sort of tool used repeatedly through the starve or kneel tactics that the regime has deployed. So simply for the purposes of providing humanitarian assistance for the population in Idlib, I don't see that as a significant solution.
And Ms. Kaffir?
I would endorse all the comments already made by my colleagues and simply add that I do think that this is a vital issue for the United States. It speaks to Russia's wider effort not only to keep the Assad regime in power, but to re-normalize it among the international community, as well as to co-opt and degrade international institutions, including the UN. This is about far more than just Syria. It is therefore vital that the United States hold this line or risk setting additional precedent that I guarantee Russia will attempt to use elsewhere. It is important not only, therefore, to preserve as many of the lives as possible that are at risk in Idlib, but also to preserve the rules-based international order, as Dana has already mentioned, that Russia is trying so hard to degrade. It's important. I applaud the administration for what they have already done to prevent the renormalization of the Assad regime, and we need to do far more, as you have rightly noted, to hold accountable the UN and other aid organizations for not enabling this regime and its backers.
Thank each of you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Cicilline, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. I want to speak a little bit about Turkey's capacity to accept additional refugees. They are currently host to almost, I think, a little over 3.5 million Syrian refugees. And what are the implications of another exodus of refugees into Syria, both politically, in terms of the conflict, and just in terms of the humanitarian capacity? Ms. Jewell and Mr. Lang.
I'll take the political, and Mr. Lang
Perfect.
can take the humanitarian. So clearly, Turkey and President Erdogan see this as an existential issue, both the economic downturn in Turkey and rising anti-Syrian, anti-refugee sentiment. I was just speaking to someone the other day who said, regardless of political party or ethnic affiliation in Turkey, one unifier is everyone hates Syrian refugees in Turkey. So this is a political winner for Erdogan, and Turkey clearly backed up its line about not having more refugees flood into Turkey, given the capacity and generosity it's already exhibited, and in pressuring Europe in the way it did by sending busloads toward Greece.
There is no doubt that the government in Turkey is under tremendous popular pressure not to receive additional refugees, and in addition to pressure refugees who are currently there to return into deeply unsafe circumstances. And we do have some examples of where the Turkish government has, in essence, refooled refugees who are currently in Syria, currently in Turkey, back into Syria. That said, the question that presents itself is if and when the ceasefire breaks down, and if the Assad regime, and with Russian backing, is able to continue its campaign, you already have a situation which is, the best analogy is a Gazification of the border and the displacement camps along that area in highly untenable circumstances. So, just in terms of in line with humanitarian principles, we would urge the government of Turkey to be able to open that border and allow some to come through if and when we could make additional humanitarian support available to those refugees when they come across. I mean, in many ways, the Syrian refugees, if they're confronted with the option of hundreds of thousands of people pushing up against the wall that they've built, trying to struggle to get over, flanked from behind by bombing campaigns by the Russians or Syrian troops, that's going to be a tremendous amount of pressure on the Turks to allow folks to come in. Another option, and we will probably see this if the campaign resumes, is you will see a movement of IDPs not only up against the line or the border with Turkey, but increasingly over into Afrin province, where they control the territory, where Turkey controls the territory significantly. And so there could be a push to, in essence, provide additional humanitarian assistance in Afrin, because it's probably a place that will be a little bit more secure than Idlib should the offensive undertake again. Again, the key point here is that we should do everything in our power to maintain the ceasefire as it currently stands. But it will be a devastating humanitarian situation if the offensive resumes and Turkey doesn't open the border.
Thank you. Ms. Caporelli, you listed 3 things the United States should do in exchange for additional support of Turkey, or should demand, rather, the return of the Russian weaponry, the leaving the Russian-led process and agreeing to a process led by the United States. Those seem like almost unachievable with respect to the current thinking of Turkey and President Erdogan. What prospects do you think exist really, and what could we do to make that more likely, to make those 3 objectives potentially achievable?
Thank you for the question. I think in some respects, the United States actually needs to learn from the Russians in this case. Putin has strong-armed Erdogan into multiple agreements that favor Russia and disfavor Turkey because Russia has leverage over Turkey and knows how to use it. I am recommending that we start doing the same. We start putting options on the table that include incentives for good behavior from Erdogan, which does need to include not only addressing the humanitarian situation, but also not using the refugee population to accomplish its objectives of ethnic cleansing by resettling Arab refugees in Kurdish areas. And we need to put coercive leverage on the table because Erdogan is not behaving as an ally and he's not going to start to. But the scale of the demands that I am recommending that we make of Erdogan are consistent with the scale of the demands that Putin has continued to make of Erdogan. It's time that we begin to play the actual great power politics that is underway in Syria and has been underway in Syria since 2015, instead of watching from the sidelines and hoping and wishing for enduring ceasefires and a political solution to the war.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. And I apologize, Mr. Malinowski, for not glancing at the monitor. Mr. Kinzinger, followed by Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you all for being here. We're all kind of exhausted of this conflict, and nobody's more exhausted than the Syrian people. And the problem is, I think, we sometimes need to be reminded of what's really going on. The media will cover when there's a picture of a kid in the back of an ambulance, and that gets about a week or 2 of attention. and then it gets overtaken by whatever drama is going on here that really, in the grand scheme of things, doesn't matter, and people just get bogged down in that. We have a candidate for U.S. president that still is repeating Putin's talking points that Bashar al-Assad never even used chemical weapons. And there are a group of people out there that actually believe that. As they read certain websites, and this person's running for president, and therefore they must have great knowledge. This is a bipartisan failure. This was a failure of the last administration in stopping Russia from even being involved in Syria in the first place, from the Red Line situation, from saying good words with no action, and it's been a failure of this administration from making claims that we need to be out of everywhere in the Middle East, bring everybody home, let the world burn, from the view of 2 different proclamations that we're leaving Syria, only to confuse our allies and excite our enemies, a lack of articulation of what our interest is in Syria and the reason that it matters to us. It's not just because we see a picture of a kid in the back of an ambulance and we feel bad, but it's because it is in the United States' interest not to cede that ground to Russia, to Iran, and to allow that evil to exist. President Clinton once said his greatest regret was inaction in Rwanda. And I think this generation will look back and say our greatest regret is inaction in Syria, not just because of the human toll, which is devastating, but because of the politics that will follow here. As Ms. Cavarella said, we have basically every, we'll call it an empire, but every large nation that has some presence in Syria right now. And we see with the exchange of fire between Turkey and Russia that we're always on the verge of some major conflict. And yet the world is asleep at the switch. You know who else bears a lot of blame? Is the entire continent of Europe that is feeling the effects of this and doing nothing and looking to the United States to solve all the problems. I'm for a strong U.S. foreign policy, but I also think our allies need to have some skin in the game as well. We have more outrage here sometimes over what's going on in Yemen than we do over the 500,000 people that are dead in Syria. The United States accidentally bombs a hospital in Afghanistan, and it's all over the news for 2 weeks. We do a debrief in the military. We find out everything that went wrong. We apologize, as we should. And every day, Russia, backed by Iran and backing the Assad regime, bomb hospitals, and nobody cares. And people talk about maybe we need to talk with Russia. Maybe we need to be friends with them. That's the problem we see in Syria. And it would have been much easier to intervene earlier. But I'll tell you, our worst case scenarios of Syria with intervention, that we said if we intervene, look at what happened in Libya. Libya is far better off than Syria, by the way. But everything we said was the worst case scenario has actually been tripled by inaction. And by the way, it's only going to get worse. This does not burn itself out. It's a fire in an apartment complex, not a fire in a house out in the country. It will catch and it will spread. Ms. Caffarella, this is obviously the worst humanitarian crisis since the start of this conflict. What would you say was the turning point in this conflict, and how did we let it get so bad?
Thank you. It's an excellent question. In my view, there have been multiple turning points. We're entering our 10th year of the war. But I would point to the Russian intervention in 2015. But I think the actual turning point was a passive decision that we made to cede Syria to the Russians. There was no reason, actually, we needed to do that. We continue to act like the Russians are 10 feet tall, even though the Russian commitment to Syria is actually quite limited, and Russian capabilities are actually far, far smaller than the Russians claim and that the world seems to see. The Turks are demonstrating, actually, the limits of Russia's leverage and military capability in Syria through the Turkish campaign in Idlib, which has imposed costs on the regime, but also on the Russians, because Turkey has attacked Russian proxy forces and destroyed Russian-provided air defense systems. So in my view, it is our inaction, actually, that was the turning point, and especially with respect to the Russians. We're ceding an entire theater to a man, Putin, that considers the United States his top enemy.
Mr.
We're defeating
Chairman,
ourselves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back, but I do want to make a quick comment in closing, if you give me leverage. Every time the Russians come up to a red line and they are pushed back, we think of when we killed the Wagner Group folks in Syria, and every time, and Turkey, as Ms. Kaffir mentioned very well, they back off. Putin will advance as far until he hits a brick wall. The problem is we haven't put too many brick walls in front of him. So, sorry I had more questions for all you guys, but we have limited time. I thank you all for being here, and Mr. Chairman, I'll be back.
Thank you, Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Malinowski, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As usual, I agree with Mr. Kinzinger on this. Agree with Mr. Wilson that it's a shame that we don't have that many members of the press, and I'm struck by just how much less attention this crisis is getting than, I guess, the last crisis that everyone paid attention to in Syria, the Turkish incursion into the northeast, which all of us rightly condemned. It was a horrible thing. It had terrible humanitarian and human rights consequences, but not nearly as great as what is happening in Idlib. And I think my observation on that would be that I guess it was easier for a lot of us, particularly, admittedly, people on my side of the aisle, to scream and shout over what happened in the Northeast because it was a case of Trump reversing an Obama policy. Whereas in this case, for us to be really, really angry at the administration would require acknowledging that Obama also failed, because the Trump policy is essentially identical to the Obama policy when it comes to how we deal with the Assad regime in Russia. I wanted to ask, first of all, tell us a little bit, and this can go to anybody, tell us a little bit about the civilian population living in and around Idlib. And I think what I want to particularly bring out here is that this is a place of last resort from people from every part of Syria. Isn't it true that there are people who were bused and moved to this area from other parts of Syria, often at our encouragement, because this was the last place in the country where they might be safe?
Yes, thank you. You're exactly right. The population of Idlib in 2011, before the war started, was 1.5 million. It has doubled today, and it has doubled because all over Syria, whenever there were de-escalation agreements or ceasefire agreements negotiated by Russia on behalf of the Assad regime, sometimes the United States was a party to those ceasefire agreements. Not one has Assad adhered to, but in the context of those agreements, opposition and civilians were offered a choice: submit to the regime or be bused to Idlib.
Right.
And everyone knew what life under regime control was like.
And now we're basically, you know, in a situation where they have to submit to the regime or flee in the place where we said where they would be safe. Well, let's get down to brass tacks. Ms. Kaffir, I thought you laid out the choices in a very honest way. No one wants to help Turkey, but Turkey is the only power willing to help civilians here, and so perhaps we can leverage that. You mentioned deployment of Patriots. Most people think of Patriots as a defensive weapon against incoming missiles, but I think you were implying that the Patriots Patriots placed along the border in southern Turkey could be used to enforce a no-fly zone. Could you explain how that might work?
Yes, thank you. The Turks have already established some of the conditions necessary for a no-fly zone. They've begun shooting Syrian jets out of the sky. They've begun shooting Syrian helicopters out of the sky. They are likely responsible for providing man pads that have also shot additional Syrian jets out of the sky, and which have forced Russia's jets to fly at even higher altitudes, disrupting their effectiveness. My general proposal is that we back Turkey in what Turkey is already doing, and that we provide Turkey the form of military support that it has requested right now, which is Patriot systems. That can help Turkey prepare for when, in my view, and not if, the Russians decide actually to start hitting back against the Turks and punishing them for the intervention or trying to change the military
Including
balance.
potentially on the Turkish side of the border. I mean, Turkey would be vulnerable to rocket missile attacks that Patriots could, you know, defend against, thus giving them greater confidence to do what they're doing.
Yes, absolutely. It would also be an important show of solidarity.
Right. The administration, I think, has suggested, or at least some people we've spoken to, that all the Patriots are being used elsewhere, including defense of U.S. troops deployed in the Gulf. What would be your answer to that?
Sure, I would simply say that we're the United States of America, and we're capable of making these decisions. The Pentagon may not want to do it, but this is a matter of prioritization. I would never, of course, condone putting American troops at risk. That's not what's at stake here. There are options. And I think the key here is that we see Syria not only as a humanitarian catastrophe, but the front line of NATO against Russia. And I find it hard to believe that there is reason to doubt that the front line against Russia is an inappropriate use of those kinds of weapon systems.
Thank you. Well, let me just say I agree basically with your proposal. I think there is, we should be willing to make that commitment, and because Turkey has a desperate need for it, there's a moment of leverage that we should use to deal with the S-400 issue, to deal with the way in which they weaponize refugees to pressure other countries and all of our other concerns. And I hope that the administration is listening. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Malinowski. As Mr. Kinzinger leaves, I just want to take a moment just to express my gratitude for the members' participation today, and in particular, I'm reminded by Mr. Kinzinger and Mr. Malinowski how fortunate we are to have thoughtful voices on this committee. So I thank you, thoughtful voices on this committee, which is an appropriate time for me to turn it over to you, Mr.
You are
Conway.
so kind, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much. And thank you to the panel for being here. I'm sorry I'm late. I had a hearing in my other committee on coronavirus. Maybe I should start with that. Ms. Stroll, what's your sense of how the Iranian regime has managed coronavirus in Iran, and has it done further damage to credibility of that regime with the Iranian people?
Well, I think my view is that the Iranian regime has, sorry, can you, good? Thank you for the question. The Iranian regime has done tremendous damage to its credibility, both with the Iranian people in the region and globally, starting with lying about the downing of the Ukrainian airliner and now in its handling of the coronavirus. If you look at some of the maps of where coronavirus is apparently nothing in Syria, very little in Iran. There are also no good reports coming out of Turkey. What do some of these different capitals have in common? A tendency towards authoritarianism. And this specifically in Iran, the mismanagement and suppression of information both to its own population and globally, I think has tremendous implications both for the Middle East more broadly, and this is another increase in economic pressure on the Iranian regime given the protests and given the administration's policy of maximum pressure.
Yes, speaking truth to the people about a difficult situation, however painful it might be, is good advice for every country. Would you not agree?
I wholeheartedly agree.
Including our own. Mr. Lang, 40% of newly displaced people have settled in open fields, tents, makeshift shelters, and the like. What's the risk of coronavirus just like wildfire spreading through that kind of situation where you have, at best, rudimentary hygiene, sanitary conditions, and virtually non-existent medical services?
Thank you very much for the question. In a word, high. In fact, very high. I think, and the situation is not only complicated by the fact that you have so many people living in such close proximity to one another with so little infrastructure, so little sanitation, so basic services that are being provided, but because the healthcare system in Idlib has been decimated, largely at the hands of Russian aircraft, the kind of mechanisms that would normally step in to provide basic support to those kind of populations simply aren't there. So we're going to have to get extremely creative about how we support local aid workers, local aid groups, local NGOs, and even some aspects of the local health system that still remain to try to get the kind of technical capacity that's needed to at least educate the population about how to comport themselves. But in a nutshell, you're dealing with very little capacity at this stage and a population that is highly, highly vulnerable to this threat.
I really think this is something that deserves some attention, although there's no press here at all. In a highly sophisticated country like our own, we're, at 1,000 cases, and we just had a hearing where Dr. Fauci said it's going to get worse. flat out. It's going to get worse. Our systems are tested. We don't have enough test kits. Our ERs are overwhelmed. And we don't have a vaccine or any kind of real efficacious treatment. But for a vulnerable population on a field, in a tent, or a makeshift shelter of some kind, it's ready-made for a virus like this, and it could absolutely have an impact on the entire region. And I don't know if anyone's even rung the alarm bells that if you don't care about refugees for their own sake, for their humanity and their situation, you might want to care about it because of the spread of a viral, and I mean that in both sense, infectious disease that could affect you.
Absolutely. And in fact, most of the conversation so far that's happened around the coronavirus with respect to refugees has been sort of weaponized in terms of using it as a reason to close borders and not to allow refugees to cross borders. I think at the end of the day, that's going to have very little to do. I mean, the doctors will tell us and the CDC will tell us that has very little to do with how you deal with containing the spread of a virus like this. And it's just hard to imagine that once it makes its way, and it probably already is, in a number of these displaced communities, that it's just not going to spread like wildfire. It's not hard to imagine also that even like the sort of international humanitarian apparatus that is in place to try to manage the basic relief effort, I know at least in some theaters, the international officers are making decisions about rotation plans and schedules and whether or not people can be maintained in these areas because of the heightened risk. So the entire system is going to be tested by this effort.
And Mr. Chairman, my time's up, but just an observation. There are a lot of lessons to be learned from the Spanish influenza of 1918. And the way that spread was through military combat. It started here in Kansas, and it spread through training camps where we were mustering large groups of men. They were men then. And, of course, when they were transported to Europe, they brought the influenza, a transmuted lethal form of influenza, to Europe on both sides. And 50 million people ended up dying with a mortality rate that is the same, over 3%, as the current mortality rate with this virus, even though we've had medical advances. So presumably the combat going on in the region could also be, in addition to refugees, a way of spreading the virus. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Mr. Sherman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Today's hearing reminds us that when Assad was close to losing power and the ability to kill hundreds of thousands of people, the government of Iran rushed in, and that the proper image of the government in Tehran is not the dapper Foreign Minister Zarif, but is rather Alan Kurdi, that boy on the Mediterranean coast of Turkey, 2 or 3 years old, a picture that brought home to the world the catastrophe which continues in Idlib. We've got millions of people displaced in Idlib. We need to make sure that our humanitarian aid goes directly to them, that it is not purloined by the Syrian government. Has Turkey been cooperating in recent months to ensure that humanitarian assistance actually reaches Idlib province? Ms. Stroll?
Harden will be in a better position to answer the specifics of Turkey's provision of humanitarian aid. The 2 cross-border areas that remain open right now are along the Turkish-Syrian border. The challenge, of course, is the completely non-permissive environment of Idlib. So it is incredibly difficult to deliver aid across the borders, given the fact that you have Al-Qaeda affiliates, and an active hot war with Assad backed by Russia and Iran every single day, not to mention the infrastructure and the civilian infrastructure of Idlib being constantly bombarded and bombed by Russia.
Are we sending, and I'll ask anyone on the panel, are we sending any donations in cooperation or through the Syrian regime? I assume not, but I'm going to ask.
Sir, to the extent that our international assistance is channeled through the United Nations, there are elements of that assistance then that are worked through Damascus. That much is clear. Very little of that assistance, in fact none, is making its way in a significant fashion to have impact in the situation in Idlib right now.
So the UN is giving valuable assets to the war criminal in Damascus, and we're contributing toward that?
My sense is the United Nations is laboring under extremely difficult circumstances in Damascus, and that as part of the process for trying to deliver humanitarian assistance to areas under government
Hitler
control.
killed a lot of people, but delivering food to Hitler wasn't a way to
Correct.
to ameliorate the harm he was doing.
Right.
And we continue to contribute toward UN programs that send the assets to Assad.
We continue to contribute.
And none of the, and virtually none of that actually reaches the people of Idlib province. Is there any good thing that happens with that UN aid?
Sure, I would say this, because it's an extremely good question, and it's a very difficult set of circumstances. There are many populations in areas under government control that require humanitarian assistance. And some of that assistance from the United Nations is making its way to those populations. The question
Providing
really
those
is,
populations swear loyalty to Assad.
or at least are not in open dissent with Assad, correct?
Since the signing of the ceasefire agreement on March 4th, do we expect Turkey's troop levels to remain the same? And what is the likelihood that Turkey will be able to successfully maintain the agreed security corridor surrounding the M4 highway?
Yes, I do expect that Turkey's military posture will remain. They've established the kinds of positions that indicate that they are in this for the foreseeable future. I do expect that the Turks can deliver on their side of the agreement with Russia. I do not expect that Russia will deliver on its side, in part because Russia has demonstrated an inability and in some cases an unwillingness to compel Assad to abide by such agreements.
I yield back.
Thank you, thank you, Mr. Sherman. Mr. Lang, I'll yield myself 5 minutes. Mr. Lang, can we take a step back for a minute? In a decade now, how many Syrians has Assad slaughtered, either directly or with the support of the Russians and Iranians?
We're approaching the 500,000 mark, if not over.
Right. I don't. I mean, we've 500,000, 600,000. It's hard to even keep track. How many people have been forced to flee Syria?
Over 5 million.
And how many have been internally displaced?
At this stage, over 6 million.
Right. 5 million have fled, 6 million internally displaced, over 500,000 dead. How is it that we're numb, Ms. Kaffir? How is that?
Well, it's unacceptable that we're numb, in my view, but I think that we have lost sight of who we are, in my view, as a nation. We've lost sight of what we can do in this region. And that's partly because we've made some mistakes, but we've deluded ourselves into thinking that we can't stand up against this guy.
Right. Now, you, Ms. Kaffir, and Ms. Struhl both made reference to this tenuous moment for the rules-based order. Isn't the rules-based order, since the end of World War II, isn't the United Nations the place where the rules-based order should be on full display? Isn't that the safeguard? And isn't the United Nations Security Council the place that ought to be able to come together at moments like this, Ms. Struhl?
Yes.
And is it appropriate for us to simply say, we're going to go to the UN Security Council and the Russians are going to veto? That's not the best use of our time. Should that be our approach?
My personal view is no. I think it is worth the hard stakes diplomacy of forcing the Russians to veto to protect their people.
Because everything we've talked about in terms of potential solutions, the way that we're going to approach Turkey, whether it's pressuring Turkey to leave Astana and return or destroy the S-400, work more closely with us, whether it's the as you talked about, the need for them to engage, for Turkey to engage. More broadly, we're trying to get to Geneva and move away from the outside. They're all the things we're talking about, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Russia, all of that can be brought together at the Security Council, can't it? I'm just, look, I don't know. I have all kinds of questions about the specifics and cross-border points and the specifics of the humanitarian crisis and the needs that have to be met and the way to protect the border, and those are all really important. But big picture here, if we're numb to it, if we do a hearing on this dire crisis in a country where Assad has slaughtered over 500,000 people and there's no one who cares, then isn't the way, with kids freezing to death right now, isn't the one idea to pull this all together and marshal our resources at the UN? And if Russia wants to veto a Security Council resolution that lays out the need not just to address the humanitarian crisis, not just to address everything that you've so eloquently spoken to, but to preserve the rules-based order, then let's make them do it. Isn't that right?
Putin's goal is not to preserve the rules-based order. He thrives, he wins, he succeeds when that system breaks down. He is working with Turkey to erode NATO. What he is doing in Ukraine, what he did in Georgia, what he is doing now in Syria. All of these policies are designed to break the rules-based order as well as the norms-based order. So the future of conflict in the Middle East looks like Idlib. That benefits Putin, and it disadvantages us and our European partners.
I completely agree. And to that end, shouldn't we be making that case not just here and not just in Congress, and passing sanctions is important, but shouldn't we be making that case in front of the world and in front of Putin? If we're at a moment, and again, it's one thing to be numb to a humanitarian crisis, and there's never an excuse for that. But if we're at a moment where the rules-based international order is at risk, and it's at risk because of what you just described, and what Putin has tried to do in Idlib at the same time that they're trying to undermine democracies all around the world. If that's the case, isn't it time that we rally the world to that cause?
Yes, and that would require, with all respect to Jim Jeffrey, the special envoy for Syria, not just Jim Jeffrey. It would mean every cabinet-level official, the president of the United States, holding Russia accountable in every international forum, every international conference, making the case publicly in foreign policy speeches to the American people, and we are not doing that.
All right, Ms. Kaffir, you have thoughts on that?
I would simply add that what happens when the United States brings the full weight of this incredible country against the Russians is that Putin starts losing. He is only succeeding because we are not even showing up to the fight. It is time to show up, and it's actually time to win it, because far more is at stake than the lives of these Syrians. We're talking about global conditions towards disorder. We're talking about another kind of catastrophe, probably on the scale of Syria elsewhere in the world, if these trajectories continue. It's time for us to hold the line.
And Mr. Lang, when that happens, what's the result from the work that you do?
The lack of U.S. leadership at the international level on humanitarian issues and the rule-based order, by and large, the impact of that can't be underestimated. We're seeing across the globe the failure, our inability to engage in a way that we used to engage on humanitarian issues, on these issues of peace and security. We have always traditionally been the large tent pole in this tent. And when we pull back from that role, it has a cascade of impacts and effects, not just in Syria, but across crisis zones across the world. And that lack of leadership, or our abdication of leadership in that area, the price in humanitarian terms simply can't be underestimated.
I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. I want to thank you for reminding us of what's at stake in Idlib and in Syria. I want to thank you for not allowing this subcommittee to be numb. And in particular, I want to thank you for where we ended, which is the very fact that if we are to address this humanitarian crisis and lead in addressing humanitarian crises worldwide, and if we are going to take on this critical moment where the rules-based order is very much in jeopardy, it requires American leadership, not just, Mr. Rossi said, from Jim Jeffrey, who's doing great service for his country, but by everyone at the highest level in this administration, including the President of the United States, and at every meeting. And it cannot leave any question after any meeting that the President has with Vladimir Putin about what was said, what was discussed. We shouldn't have to guess, because every meeting like that and every statement should focus on American leadership, defending the rules-based international order, and always standing up to protect the most vulnerable. I want to thank the witnesses for being here. Thank you for your testimony. Members.
And hey, it's amazing.
Mr.
I
Wilson.
want to thank the chairman. Okay, this really is bipartisan. And indeed, I want to commend Jim Jeffrey, but also Ambassador Kelly Craft. The thought of her being in Idlib is unimaginable, but it shows again the concern of the American people. But we need your assistance and the leadership of Chairman Deutsch, and it was tremendous to have Chairman Eliot Engel here too. That was a very significant move, and I look forward in a bipartisan manner as we proceed further on behalf of the people of Syria. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I thank the ranking member. I thank you for your leadership and your commitment. Members of the subcommittee, I would remind the witnesses may have some additional questions. We ask the witnesses to please respond to those questions in writing. I'd ask my colleagues to submit any questions that they have within 5 business days. And with that, and without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.